First came news from the Attawapiskat First Nation in Northern Ontario that 11 people had tried to commit suicide in one day. 2 days later, word of a suicide pact among 13 youth. Sadly, Attawapiskat is not the first or only community in the province facing such a crisis. Joining us now to help understand what's going on and what might be done to help, Suzanne Stuart, psychologist and professor of Indigenous Healing in Counseling Psychology at OISE, and Cornelia Wyman, psychiatrist at CAMH, and we're grateful to both of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Let's just put a couple of facts up here before we start. This news has been shocking. 101 people in the community of 2,000 attempting suicide since last September. Last weekend alone, 11 people attempted suicide in one day. First Nations youth are 5 to 7 times more likely to commit suicide than non-Indigenous youth, and this is Attawapiskat's 5th state of emergency since 2006. Suzanne, some reserves seem to be much more at risk than others, and certainly, as we've indicated, much more than the general population. Let's get into some discussion here about why that is. Explain.
Well, in psychology, over the last 15 to 20 years, quite a bit of research has actually been done on suicidality in youth in rural and reserve communities. And that research shows that communities that have high levels of resources, connection to traditional culture, including language, control of education, control of infrastructure, like police and medical services, have very low rates of suicide. And communities that have very little of what's termed cultural continuity seem to have very high rates, where communities where there's little to no resources for youth and families, low or high unemployment, low educational resources, and low educational attainment and achievement, and of course poverty. Poverty is a huge factor when it comes to mental health issues.
So it sounds like Attawapiskat has none of the things it needs and all of the things it doesn't need.
That's right.
Anything you'd add to that, Cornelia?
No, I think Susan talked a lot about that research, which is really important. And I mean, basically, I think it's important to know that, you know, this type of, even though it's called a crisis, it didn't happen overnight. These conditions have been building up over a long period of time and include the social determinants, what we call the social determinants of health. So it's things like poverty, economic conditions,
Housing, access to water.
Clean water, you're right. Historical trauma related to residential schools in the 60s scoop, things like that. So all of these conditions kind of, you know, are there constantly in the community, but at some point, for whatever reason, you know, things boil over into the crisis we see today.
Let me follow up on that, though. There are children today who are attempting to take their own lives, who were not a part of the 60s scoop and who didn't go to residential schools. So how does that have an impact on the decision that they make to try to kill themselves?
It's probably at least twofold. So we know that there's circumstances in the community, what's called intergenerational trauma. So the trauma that the parents and grandparents who may have directly been affected by the residential schools or 60 scoop experience, the parents have been affected, but it also carries down to how the children are raised, how families interact, how communities sort of function all together. And probably the second thing is just related to the current status in the communities of what the conditions are like. I mean, if you can imagine what it's like to go to a school that's full of mold in a portable that's not properly heated, day in, day out. You know, there's a lot of really difficult circumstances that these young people have to deal with.
Suzanne, the MP for the riding, Charlie Angus, New Democrat Member of Parliament, called this a suicide pandemic. Is that the right term to use for this?
Well, I'm not really fond of buzzwords. I like more looking at things and breaking down what the factors are and what it looks like in the bigger picture. When we look at the bigger picture, following what my colleague Dr. Wyman said, this isn't something new, and this isn't something that's really a surprise to people who understand the First Nations context and who understand the history of Canada when it comes to Indigenous people. These communities have lived without their basic needs and services met for not just years, but decades. And further to that, living in an environment where people don't have their basic needs met, on top of living with trauma related to historical and current abuses, neglect, colonial assaults through residential school, and the 60 scoop, forced land relocation, and the list really goes on. It gives people very little resources to deal with the ups and downs of everyday life.
But Cornelia, the word pandemic suggests it's contagious. Is it contagious, the feeling of the need to kill oneself?
Well, I think in that case, there is evidence that suicides sometimes in small communities occur in clusters. But I think the word pandemic, and I don't want to interpret what Mr. Angus said, is it raises the importance of this issue, right? It causes alarm, which I think needs to be, right? We can't allow these conditions to continue in these communities. But I don't think I don't also think, on the other hand, that it's true necessarily, because some communities are doing really well. And I think it's important to know that, yes, there are some communities in crisis, and yet there's some communities that do really well. There is still a lot of strength and resilience in the community of Attawapiskat, and I think both of us want that to be really clear.
You put that on the record, but let's go to Continuum, which has been described as the suicide capital of the world. Suicide's not at all prevalent there until 20 years ago or so, and then the numbers have grown since. How and why, Suzanne, does an idea, a suicide pact or suicide clusters, how does that idea take root and spread?
So, maybe I can talk about that a little bit from my experience in working in remote communities, as well as my research with Aboriginal youth around mental health. So for youth, especially Indigenous youth, there's issues around cultural identity, racism and oppression. Those are things that youth experience on a daily basis. In addition to the normal identity, the usual identity development tasks that most youth are dealing with around, autonomy, trying to grow up and find themselves. So when we have Indigenous youth in a remote community, or a community that doesn't have the services that, say, urban youth might be able to access, I think that feeling of hopelessness and despair can come on a lot more quickly.
Any thoughts to follow up on there, and why these things seem to happen in clusters?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, in small communities, people tend to know each other. Everybody knows each other. Everybody knows what's going on with each other to a large extent. So I think when one person reaches the point where, unfortunately, they feel that all their options are limited and they're feeling quite despairing and hopeless, and perhaps make a gesture of self-harm or express suicidality, that other people around them sort of see, yeah, I feel the very same. I think in this case, it's important to note that it may not necessarily, the suicidal attempts may not necessarily be related to mental illness per se, but as we've been saying since the beginning of the show, that there are a lot of other social factors that play a role in this case.
Generally speaking, Suzanne, how aware are the parents of the young people who are trying this that their children may be considering it, or may have some kind of pact with their friends, that kind of thing?
Well, I think that's really hard to say about these specific cases in this specific community, but I think generally speaking, we know that adolescence is often a time of storm and stress, and traditionally in our communities, youth were often closely connected with the elders, right? If we look at some of the ways that families and communities were structured prior to impact by Western European culture, the youth and the elders worked together on different things, and youth would go to elders for their problems, and sometimes those elders aren't really available in the communities anymore. So I think a lot of times young people feel like they don't have anyone to go to because they're naturally at that time when they're in conflict with their parents.
Understood. What happens when a state of emergency is called, as has been the case now?
Well, in this case, a state of emergency means bringing in resources, right? And that's really what's needed right now. Whether those are the correct or the most helpful resources, I'm not really sure what the answer to that question is. But one thing I think resources that are necessary are healing resources that are culturally safe for these young people, healing resources that address these needs holistically and not just in isolation. So in other words, not just looking at the youth and what they need. Of course, what they need is paramount and very important, but looking at what the families need, what the siblings need, what the people who are supporting the youth in the community need, because this is like a ripple effect of need in the community.
Cornelia, I'm going to ask actually both of you, if you would, to look at the monitor just over my shoulder there, because they asked youth in the community, what do you need? And this was a list, I guess, that was on made up by kids at the community center. And there are all sorts of, youth-centered, drug and alcohol-free, youth camp, more workshops, track and field, a cinema, a library, skateboard park. Cornelia, is there any reason to believe that if the communities had these additional resources, these suicide incidents would go away?
I think hopefully at least the suicide problem would decrease in a community. Again, like Suzanne, I can't specifically predict what will happen in Attawapiskat, but through the research that I've been a part of looking at indigenous youth suicide, there have been some anecdotal evidence that putting in something like a skating rink in a community will decrease the level of suicide rates in that in the community.
Because?
Kids are more active. Physical activity is actually has a beneficial effect on people's mood and sense of well-being, and probably it increases their sense of identity. They're competent at something. They're good at something. So there's a whole variety of reasons why putting in something recreational, which you wouldn't intuitively think would be a mental health intervention, but actually is shown to be benefit in some of these communities.
So the next question then becomes, we're talking about a community of 2,000 people, a very long way north of Ottawa and Queen's Park. So what are the chances that any of these things, a cinema, a YMCA, a skate park, youth camp, what are the chances any of this can happen?
Well, unfortunately, it seems like the choices and resources are not things that are up to the community. And when in fact, the community actually has treaty rights that allow them to have resources to give the things to their young people and to the families in the community that they need. One of the things, I'm not sure if it was on that list or not, but one of the things that a large body of research shows is that when young people have regular access to traditional cultural resources, like learning how to speak their language, engaging in traditional activity such as hunting, fishing, trapping, making traditional clothing, doing things that have to do with learning who they are as an Indigenous people and learning their traditional ways of living, that mental health problems such as depression, suicide, basically go down to almost zero. And I haven't really heard anyone talking in this whole time about what the traditional health and healing resources are for this community, because they are there and they do exist, and they've existed for thousands of years before Ottawa started sending in Western medical health professionals.
Speaking of Ottawa, we're going to play a clip now, and we're going to get into some controversy, and I'd like your views on this. Jean Chrétien is a former Prime Minister of Canada. He's a former Indian Affairs Minister. He adopted a First Nations child to be his son, and he thinks he knows this situation pretty well as a result of those experiences. Again, take a look at the monitor. Here's what he had to say about advice for handling the situation in Attawapiskat. Roll the clip, please, Sheldon.
When I quit politics in '84, came back a few years later, I spent a lot of time visiting reserve in northern Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And it was extremely difficult at that time. It's difficult. There is no economic base, therefore, having jobs and so on. And sometimes they have to move like anybody else.
You have to move like anybody else. Cornelia, is that an option here?
Well, I guess I'd preface it by saying I have a lot of respect for our former Prime Minister. I can't say whether or not the comments that have gotten that comment, which has gotten a lot of media attention, is taken out of context necessarily, but I disagree with the notion that communities have to relocate. The reasons for people remaining where they are complex, but have a lot to do with those being the indigenous peoples of that region. That's their traditional lands. There's a connection to those lands, including a spiritual connection. So it's not an easy solution to just say people should just move. I think that there is a lot more work that can be done at the community level to improve conditions there. And I personally feel that each community has enough strength to prioritize for themselves in which direction they want to go. Whether it be taking advantage of natural resources or developing technology that can be used from afar. I mean, over the computers, internet, etc. It's not for me to say, but I think to just say, people should just move, I disagree with that personally.
Suzanne, I'm going to push back a little bit here. I completely understand the connection to the land. I appreciate the spiritual significance of where these communities have been for many, many generations. I appreciate that their elders, their forefathers and foremothers are buried on these lands. Their kids are killing themselves. Which ought to take higher priority?
So I guess my first response would be that Indigenous people are not just like other people who need to move to where the resources are. In fact, the resources are actually where these people live. Similar close to the time that this happened in the media, the suicide epidemic, there were newspaper accounts of diamonds being found in the same region that are worth billions of dollars. So in fact, there are actually resources, economic resources within the area that could actually be supporting these communities, but those resources don't belong to these communities, and I don't think these communities get a fair share of these resources given that it was traditionally their territory, and there are treaties that talk about these rights that aren't being honored right now. And in fact, right now, from what I understand, the federal government is denying Attawapiskat its treaty rights to be able to have the resources to deal with their own problems around this, again, tracing back to the political. One more point about Indigenous people needing to move to the city. Well, quite frankly, I think it's sort of rude and assimilationist of all of us to be talking about what we think a community should do about their healing needs. It's those communities who really need to make up their own minds and be given the space and autonomy and resources to be able to do that, and for us to support those decisions.
I totally hear you on that, but if these communities are in distress and are as dysfunctional as they are right now, are they even capable of making that kind of a decision right now?
So I think to say that the whole community is dysfunctional because the young people are making a cry for help is sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I mean, we've both said it a number of times in this interview that really the problems in this community are more traceable to the social determinants of health rather than individual mental health dysfunctions and problems. And we look at, any environment, many studies have been done not just with Indigenous people, but with many marginalized and diasporic people across the world, that when people have their basic needs removed, they don't do well anymore. And when we see that happening over several generations, this is what the outcome is.
I'm really trying to figure out, Cornelia, help me with this. I know there are lots of quote unquote non-Indigenous people watching us right now who want to help.
Right.
They want to do the right thing. They can't stand picking up the paper every day and hearing about this kind of tragedy. They want to do something constructive, and they have no idea what to do. And it doesn't look like the leaders of our communities, the people who are in positions to make decisions, are able to respond adequately or quickly enough. And a lot of the things that Suzanne just said are going to take years to put into place, and these kids don't have years. So we don't want to throw up our hands and just say, we can't do anything, so what do?
Well, I think partly as a as your viewers watching from home can do, I mean, it really seems like this particular episode in Attawapiskat has raised people's awareness. There's been a lot of coverage of it. I think part of what the average Canadians can do is continue to put pressure on their local MP to continue to advocate for change in their role in the House of Commons. But I think on another hand, there has been a lot of work already done on the issue of First Nations youth suicide, going back all the way to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. 15 years ago, I sat on a advisory group that made specific recommendations around how to address the First Nations youth suicide problem in this country. In 2014, there was something called the Mental Wellness Continuum Framework. All of these documents exist, and so there are tools already there with multiple recommendations, often repeating themselves over time, that haven't been acted upon. So I think it behooves us all to get active and encourage our federal government representatives, who mainly are in charge of delivering healthcare, social services to on-reserve communities, to get going and not let things wait for months or even years.
Suzanne, I'll give you the last word here. We saw earlier this week the Health Minister of Ontario, who doesn't have prime jurisdiction over this. He flew up there, visited, saw to it that I think 4 or 5 more counselors would be brought on the scene. Is that going to help?
Well, definitely sending up resources of any kind to support a community who have little to no resources is very important, and I think that's wonderful. And I do love to hear that the consciousness of Canada is being raised on this issue, because no one wants to hear about young people of any community taking their lives or attempting to do so. But I think the consciousness raising needs to go a step further in people beginning to understand that this isn't a First Nations problem, this isn't a government problem, this is a Canadian problem that has its roots in the colonial settler relationship, and that this is something that we all need to begin to understand by educating ourselves on what it means to be Canadian in an Indigenous context, and understanding what that means for us to influence the government, as Dr. Wyman says, around making good on the treaty relationships that already exist, making good on those promises, as well as implementing the many tools, resources, supports, and initiatives that have already been developed around youth suicide that just haven't been implemented.
Gotcha. I thank both of you for coming in tonight, helping us out with this. I think we've learned a lot more thanks to your visit here. Suzanne Stuart from OISE, Cornelia Wyman from CAMH. My thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.